We're ready now to get into the liquidity preference framework. The idea is very simple. The idea is that the interest rate is determined in the money market by the demand for money and by the supply of money. And it may seem kind of strange to talk about the demand for money. You might think, well, don't we demand as much money as we can get? Well, no. Remember, we're thinking in terms of, when we talk about the demand for money, or the demand for bonds, we're thinking in terms of what fraction of a person's wealth do they want to hold in the form of money versus the other way of holding it, which would be bonds. So, you know that people always like money. They always would like to get more money if it doesn't cost them anything. We're dealing with the question, how much money do people want to hold relative to bonds? And the supply of money will defer for a moment. We're going to make a simplifying assumption that the supply is simply determined by the Fed. So we'll focus first on the demand for money. The quantity of money on the horizontal axis and the interest rate on the vertical axis. We're going to assert that the money demand curve is a negatively sloped line. Anytime you see a curve, ask yourself, what does the slope of that curve tell me? If it's negatively sloped, that means that tells you something about the relationship between the two variables. Anytime you have a negatively sloped curve, it means the variables, what's the relationship between them? Okay. It means there's an inverse relationship. If one goes up, the other goes down. So the negative slope of this demand curve is telling us that if interest rates go down, then the quantity of money demanded, the amount of money people will want to hold, is going to go up. Okay? Now, why do we think that's true? Okay? Well, it has to do with opportunity cost. Let's say that the interest rate is 20%. Make it interesting. Think carefully here. When we say the interest rate is 20% and we're thinking in terms of the liquidity preference framework, which interest rate is 20%? What is offering that 20% interest? Does this mean that holding money will give you a 20% return? No. Remember, in the liquidity preference framework, we're assuming that money pays no interest at all. Interest rate on money is zero. So what interest rate is this? This is the interest rate that is paid on bonds. Okay? So the point on the money demand curve here is telling us how much money people will want to hold if the interest rate on bonds is 20%. Now, just think about it. Remember, the decision people are dealing with is how to allocate their wealth, how much to hold in the form of money, and how much to hold in the form of bonds. If you can earn 20% interest by holding bonds, that looks very attractive. So you say, I want to hold a lot of my wealth in the form of bonds. But in order to do that, what do you have to do? How do you pay for those bonds? Well, the only way you can purchase more bonds is if you use up some of your money. You're going to have to reduce your money holding or keep your money holdings low if you want to hold a lot of bonds. So what we can say here is, if the interest rate on bonds, the interest rate on bonds is 20%. In other words, if it's high, then bonds look like a really good investment. You want to hold a lot of bonds. What can we say about the quantity of money demanded? It's going to be very low. People don't want to hold a lot of money if bonds will provide them with a high interest rate. Doesn't mean people don't like money. If you offer, in this situation, if you offer them money, will they take it? Sure. You're not going to say, well, my quantity demanded is low because the interest rate's high. Now, if you offer someone money, they'll take it. The question is, do they then want to hold on to that wealth in the form of money? And the answer would be no. If the interest rate is high, you offer somebody money, they'll take it, but they'll then want to use it to buy bonds and to get that high interest rate. Okay? What if, on the other hand, interest rate on bonds is very low? So it's only 0.5%. Okay? Do bonds look as attractive? Obviously not. 20% bonds look great. 0.5% interest means if you hold $100 worth of bonds for a year, you get 50 cents of interest. You're not going to get rich quick that way. So at a low interest rate, bonds are not very attractive. You decide, I don't want to go to the trouble of buying and holding bonds. I want to hold only a small amount of my wealth in the form of bonds. I'd rather hold most of my wealth in the form of money, because even though money doesn't provide me with an interest rate, it provides me with liquidity. Money is the medium of exchange. So if I'm holding my wealth in the form of money, then whatever I want to buy, I'm already ready to do it. And if bonds are only paying 0.5% interest, you're not giving up much interest when you choose to hold money rather than bonds. So we're saying if the interest rate on bonds is low, people will choose to hold relatively few bonds. They want to hold most of their wealth in the form of money. So the quantity of money demanded would be high. That's giving us a point like that. And these 2 points demonstrate the slope of the money demand curve. As the interest rate on bonds goes down, people choose to hold a larger amount of money simply because the alternative is not as good. We can say that the interest rate represents the opportunity cost of holding money. Most people, if you ask them, what does it cost you to hold money, they would say, well, it doesn't cost me anything, when in fact it does. If you hold $100 of your wealth for a year in the form of money, you have given up something. You've given up the interest rate that you could have earned if you had instead held bonds. If the interest rate on bonds is only 0.5%, then holding $100 of wealth in the form of money for a year, it's not costing you very much. You're only giving up 50 cents of interest. But if the interest rate were 20% on bonds, then if you hold $100 for 1 year in the form of money, you are giving up the interest you could have earned if you had instead held that wealth in the form of bonds. And 20% of 100 would be $20. 20% interest rate. If you hold $100 of your wealth as money for a year, it has cost you $20 of interest that you could have received. Okay? When the opportunity cost of holding money goes up, people choose to hold less money. That's the idea there. So we've now explained the reason for the negative slope of the money demand curve. Let's think about money supply. Then we'll talk about equilibrium. We'll talk about what can cause each of these curves to shift. Okay? Money supply. What is the money supply curve going to look like? When we ask that question, we're really saying, what's the relationship between the interest rate and the amount of money available in the economy? Okay? Now, realistically, that would be a very interesting question to try to deal with and figure out. We are not really going to go into that. We're going to make an assumption. And our assumption will be that at each point in time, the Federal Reserve has some specific target for the money supply. They have decided on a particular amount of money they would like to exist at that point in time. And we will see later on that the Fed has the tools for achieving whatever goal they set. So if they decide they want the money supply to be $300 billion, and it's something less than that, then they have the ability to increase it. If it's something more than that, they have the ability to decrease it. They do have the ability to achieve any particular supply of money they want to hit. So to keep things relatively simple, we are going to make this assumption. They have a goal for the money supply. They'll do whatever it takes to reach that goal. And if that's the case, what will the money supply curve look like? Well, if our assumption here is correct, then if the interest rate is 0.5%, the money supply will be $300 billion. If it's 10%, if it's 20%, doesn't matter what the interest rate is if the Fed has decided they're going to keep the money supply at $300 billion. If that's what they have decided, then the money supply curve will simply be an upward sloping curve. So I'm sorry, a vertical curve, not upward sloping. Upward sloping would mean as the interest rate rises, the quantity of money available would increase. Since we're assuming that the Fed is keeping the money supply at $300 billion, then that's what it will be, regardless of what the interest rate is. So the money supply curve is simply a vertical line. Now, we have now said that the money demand curve is a negatively sloped line. Money supply curve is a vertical line. You can see those two intersect. Should not be surprised. This is an economics course, so what does an intersection represent? It represents equilibrium. Which means given the amount of money the Fed has decided to supply, given the money demand conditions that exist at a point in time, there's going to be one interest rate that corresponds to equilibrium. One interest rate that will cause the quantity of money demanded, the amount that people want to hold, to equal the quantity of money supplied. There's only one interest rate that will bring those two into balance. It's at that intersection. Every time we develop a model, we determine where's the equilibrium, but just as important, we have to ask, are there forces here that will push us to that equilibrium? Simply having an equilibrium is not that important if there's no reason to think we're going to move to that equilibrium. So that's the next thing we need to think about. If the interest rate is not at that equilibrium level, is there any reason to believe that there are changes that will automatically begin to occur, which will bring us to that equilibrium level. And you shouldn't be surprised to find that there